Hello everybody, welcome, I'm Jack, and today we're going to talk about this Lancia Montecarlo, or for the Brits, Lancia Montecarlo. This is a really interesting car because it is the first car that was not just designed, it was designed, developed and built by Pininfarina. It was beautiful, it was exotic, it was mid-engined, and yet it was a flop. There's three reasons for that. The first has to do with association with another Lancia model. The second is a problem with the brakes, and the third is to do with legislation. I'm going to tell you about all those, but first let's take a quick look around this car. It was designed by Paolo Martin at Pininfarina, and I'm sure you'll agree it's a really striking design. This is a Series 2 car. I'm going to tell you some of the differences with the Series 1 as well. The first of which is that grille. This has the later grille which was introduced with the Lancia Delta. Also, the Series 1's cars had really striking bow tie wheels. The other big cosmetic difference is the buttress. On the Series 1's it's just solid metal, on these it's glass, and I have to say I do prefer the glass cover that you have here. I think it works better with the overall design. Just hands it a little bit more delicacy because the back is already quite stumpy. So if you have that solid bit, it highlights how short it is. So I think this works better. The engine bay is also really interesting. For a start, the engine lid opens up sideways. So what we have there is the quintessentially amazing Lampredi Twin Cam. 120 horsepower it puts out in this version, and again in the Series 2 it's supposed to have slightly higher compression heads and therefore more torque, although I've heard conflicting opinions on that on the internet. The other really interesting thing, as you'll notice, is that it's really offset to the side, but between that, because it's transverse, between where it is and the gearbox on the side, I guess that the weight distribution works out, but I haven't seen that in many cars. Now, there was a big element of practicality because this front boot is pretty much cavernous by the standards of most mid-engine cars as well. The interior isn't the roomiest. It does suffer from Italy's 70s, early 80s quality. Some of the stuff feels pretty fragile on here. This is the quintessential squared off with the Fiat style dials, so it's quite typical for the era. The controls there for the aircon look particularly fragile. Luckily, I don't need to touch them today, and the owner, in any case, has removed the aircon from this car, which I wholly agree with, because they were never very good in the first place. Don't particularly need it. It's got what I believe is the original stereo in there, with Phil Collins as well, which is very apt. It's quite a cool little car. Driving position is pretty good, actually. I mean, you have the wheel where you want it, you have the gear stick in the right place, the pedal box isn't too cramped. Mind you, when I actually put my feet on the pedals, my legs are scrunched up, so it's a bit Italian driving position, but it doesn't bother me as much as it might bother some. Anyway, let's take it out. I'll tell you a bit more about those three things that made it fail and how it feels on the road today. So how did the Montecarlo actually come to life? Well, it all started with the Fiat 124. Fiat were keen to find a replacement for that car, and Pininfarina started working on this with that in mind. It was going to be a mid-engined V6 replacement. However, Bertone beat them to it with the X19. That didn't discourage Pininfarina though, and they carried on development. The V6 mid-engine car which they'd been working on then became an Abarth race car, which was only raced for one, I think the Giro d'Italia, which is the Tour of Italy, and it came second in that. So it was pretty successful, but for some reason Fiat didn't want to continue to use it in competition. Lancia at the time were desperate for a halo car, and it was handed to Lancia in '74. By that stage there had been the oil crisis already, 73, so the engine was downgraded from a V6 to a 4-litre, and they used the twin cam, Fiat classic twin cam Lampredi engine for that. So it was launched in 1975 to quite some excitement. It was a mid-engined Lancia. It was going to be great to spearhead its new range. Curiously, they didn't immediately just call it the Montecarlo. they first called it the Lancia Beta Montecarlo. So it was part of the Beta range of cars. As we'll see, that was going to have quite far-reaching consequences, but also it didn't really make that much sense if you think about it, because this shared almost nothing with the Beta saloons, coupes, and so on. The reason why I think they did it is that this was a very particular car, in that Pininfarina actually, this is, if you really go down to it, this is a Pininfarina. It's not a Fiat, it's not a Lancia, because Pininfarina styled it, developed it, and they even built it. So I guess in a way it was, I don't know, it was a way of trying to tie it in more with Lancia, to say it was part of the Beta family. It did also, of course, go on to spawn a particularly amazing car. That is the 037 rally car. It was the last one that managed to win the World Rally Championship as a two-wheel drive. So it has quite some heritage to it. In truth, the Montecarlo doesn't really have a huge amount in common with the 037. It's literally the passenger cell. That part of the chassis was taken over. Everything else really on the 037 was changed, even the layout of the engine, which was no longer transverse but longitudinal. So the poor Montecarlo looked like it had everything going for it. In actual fact, quite a few problems were looming. The first one was that it was given the Beta name, or Beta as you'd say in English. And the Beta, in the UK in particular, but all over, it suffered from incredible rust problems to the front subframe. It completely mashed Lancia's reputation and ended up making Lancia leave the UK altogether. So the association with the Beta didn't do the Montecarlo any good. Another issue with it was that the brakes in the Series 1, there was a definite flaw. Now this is a mid-engined car, and they had servo brakes, but only at the front. So what would happen, particularly in the wet, is that you'd come barreling up to a corner, brake hard, the fronts would lock up, and you'd just go straight. That was addressed in the Series 2. There was a gap in production of about 16 months between the 1 and the 2. And for the Series 2, they took away the brake servo altogether, put some bigger discs at the front. There's different wheels, as you can see. That was also to have bigger wheels to clear the bigger brakes at the front. And that problem was pretty much sorted out. There were some longer term issues though. It looked like it should be a blisteringly fast car, but even in European spec with 120 horsepower, 0 to 60 was around 9 seconds, top speed 120 miles an hour, so it wasn't really a particularly quick car. So all those issues hurt sales in Europe. They weren't terrible, but they weren't quite good enough, especially the Series 2. Once the damage had been done by the Beta, that really affected it. But the key to this car's success was the US. It had to do well in the US. But out of a total production run of about 7,800, only 1,600 were sold in the US. And there's a simple reason for that. The US cars were just absolutely awful. The European cars weren't balls of fire. The US cars had to make do because of emissions regulations with a 1.8 litre low compression engine, putting out just 83 horsepower, 40 less. On top of which it had some horrible safety bumpers, different lights, which made it ugly and heavier. So it wasn't a sports car. It didn't look good. And in the US, I think they sold 1,600. And that's what really killed off the Montecarlo. Now, today, they do have a following, and quite rightly. Now, I've been driving this now for a few minutes, and already I can tell it's one of those cars that, although flawed, I really do have a liking for. First of all, it rides ever so well. It really does have a nice ride, but it doesn't, I'm not going mega quick. It is wet, but it doesn't lean very much. The thing is though, what's it like today as a classic? Let's do a little pull through the gears. It's got a single Weber carb. seems to wake up around 3.5. There were complaints that that the engine sounded too rough, that the mechanical noise was too much. But to me, it's pretty good actually. I think it's a pretty smooth, and as I said, it wakes up around 3.5. The gear change can be bad on these. This one's been sorted and it's absolutely fine. It's really nice. It turns in very, very sweetly as well. It feels incredibly well balanced. It's not front, it's not back. So it's got that lovely mid-engine feel. It rides absolutely beautifully. It really does, and it keeps it stable on the road. The suspension works really, really well. You know what? This Montecarlo is another one of those cars that has just surprised me. It's really, really good. It really is. I'm not sure. Now I'm driving it, I'd say, at about 6/10 today. Slimy road. The chap who owns it has just literally finished restoring it, and I'm taking extra care with it. But it's a very pleasant car to drive. Maybe the engine does feel a tad underpowered, and you do have to bring it to get it to wake up a little bit, but that's okay. The brakes don't feel particularly strong. That might be because they just removed the servo. There's a little bit of travel at the lever. I mean, obviously this is an old restored car, so even though it's a very good one, I don't know if that's what they would have felt like originally. They probably did. Could do with a little bit more power, in my view. And again, engine a little bit gutless under 3,000. Well, I don't understand what all the complaints were about how noisy it was. This is the Spider even. There isn't that much wind noise. The engine to me isn't that intrusive. You don't get a lot of exhaust noise, which is a little bit of a shame because the Fiat Twin Cam I think can sound amazing, but all the same, it's a real shame because I think this is a car that should have succeeded. In terms of chassis, there's loads and loads of promise in there. It's got the same sort of strut suspension, McPherson strut all round that the X19 had. It drives incredibly well. It's a shame that those things, those sort of three separate things happened, the US in particular, which made it quite difficult for this to be a success. In terms of sales, it was certainly a flop for Lancia. It deserved to do better. Thank you all so much for watching. If you feel so inclined, please do subscribe because that really helps the channel. If you have a car, like an interesting car, an Italian car, 70s, 80s, that kind of stuff, that you want me to review, then please do get in touch. I am particularly looking at the moment for a Tamer 832, any Tamers really, any of the sort of like early Lancias, anything like that. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.